So is picky eating actually genetic? Parents actually ask me this all the time. And here's the truth. It's actually not a simple yes or no. There isn't one single picky eating gene, but there are several genes that actually can make eating a whole lot harder if they are sort of turned on or activated, right? For example, the MTHFR gene mutation. It affects nutrition, absorption, oral ties. There's taste genes that make veggies taste very, very bitter. But picky eating is never just genetics. So today we're going to look at how your child's DNA, their environment, their feeding experiences, all sort of weave together to shape how they eat. So in this episode, you're going to learn the most common genes and genetic factors that can contribute to picky eating, visible signs and symptoms to watch for. Maybe genetics are playing a role. And 3 most important steps that you can take to help your child if you are noticing some of those signs and symptoms. All right, so let's dive in. You might have heard this before, but I think it's very relevant. Genes can load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. And that's true really for just about everything, but also true, of course, when it comes to picky eating, which is always our normal topic that we're talking about on this podcast, of course. But I do hear a lot of parents relating back to their own childhood or perhaps the childhood of their spouse. Like, oh, I was a picky eater when I was young too, or my husband was picky when he was a kid. So maybe they just inherited this, like a trait of ours. And there might actually be a little bit of truth in that. But I do want to say there's probably 2 different things that could be happening before we dive into the genes, okay? Number 1, environment, right? If you or your spouse are at present, picky eaters, or maybe you don't like cooking, or you're just like not foodie people, right? Maybe you eat a limited variety of foods. Then, of course, your child is also going to be limited in what they are eating because that's what they're exposed to. They're exposed to a limited set of foods. So exposure is a big driver in how kids learn to eat, right? So that part really does make sense, right? But here's the interesting part. Most of the families that we work with, that's not actually the case. We have heard it on occasion, for sure, but it's not the norm. A lot of our parents tell us that they eat a wide variety of foods. They love foods. They love cooking even sometimes. They offer a lot of different flavors and textures, and yet their child still ended up being very picky. So in those cases, it's worth asking, is genetics part of this? So here's the thing. There is not one single picky eating gene. So let's talk about some of the genes that could be at play. And I'll tell you the biggest one first, which is the MTHFR gene mutation. So this is the big one. This gene helps your body process B vitamins. So you might have heard of folate, or perhaps you've heard of folic acid before, but basically what it's referring to is B vitamins, right? B vitamins that could affect growth, appetite, energy, even how the brain processes sensory input, right? So kids that also have a sensory component, something to think about. So if your child is not processing those B vitamins efficiently, how does it show up? Could be low appetite, could be even trouble tolerating textures, being extra sensitive around food, right? It's also linked to something called midline differences. So think about like the middle of your body. So this is where you're going to see things like tongue and lip ties. And if you're new to my work, we always talk about that, but it does impact because a tie can make feeding a little extra challenging if your tongue is restricted from moving freely as it's supposed to in the mouth. It can make feeding a struggle. Okay. It could be possibly painful or exhausting as an infant to try to figure out how to extract milk from either breast or bottle when your tongue doesn't move great, right? So they develop a lot of compensations and they funny ways to try to get that milk out, right? And even later on, this could crop up as picky eating. It's just because eating can actually literally be physically hard to do, right? So this is an important gene. Like I said, there isn't a picky eating gene, but MTHFR can come close because how it impacts nutrition and oral development, right? And here's the kicker. The foods that help support the B vitamins in your body are often the exact foods that your picky eater is probably avoiding, right? Leafy greens, beans, lentils, meats, sometimes eggs, right? Sometimes we get a little bit better response on eggs because they're softer. But sometimes those other foods can be challenging. And those are your big B vitamin foods. And those are the ones that they're pushing away, right? So their body needs them more, but their eating makes them actually harder to get into their body, which makes it even more essential that you're getting the right help for your child if they do have this gene mutation. And we're going to talk about how to actually determine that a little bit later. Okay. The other set of genes that might be quite relevant are taste receptor genes. So some kids are literally wired to taste foods differently. So one example is a gene called the TAS2R38 gene. It makes bitter flavors taste stronger. So think it's like, if you like touch a stove and you think it's warm, this person might touch a stove and think it's like burning up hot, right? So it just kind of amplifies that maybe bittery taste to be like too overwhelming, right? And that, if you think about it, would make them push away things like vegetables, right? Because vegetables can be bitter. So some kids aren't even being dramatic about broccoli. Their taste buds really are wired to taste bitterness more strongly. There's also a couple of other genes I wanted to mention that can affect the gut and how it absorbs nutrients. So for example, the FUT2 gene, that can influence your gut microbiome. It could also influence your B12 absorption. Kids with variants of this gene can have gut issues and B12 deficiency. There's another gene called the DAO gene. It affects histamine breakdown in your immune system, right? So if it's a little sluggish and it's not breaking things down, foods like tomatoes, cheese, chocolate could cause tummy pain, flushing, some upset stomach, right? It might make kids avoid some foods like that. Now, there's also a gene that's related to celiac, the HLA-DQ2 or the DQ8 gene. So if it's present, gluten can cause damage to the gut lining, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have celiac, but if it could be like a sensitivity to it, right? So none of these genes are going to directly cause picky eating. You can have these genes and be a fantastic eater, but they can, as you've seen, maybe make eating uncomfortable, or make kids want to avoid some of those foods, right? And if we always say this, right, the gut is super important. If eating hurts, most kids are going to stop eating. Sometimes picky eating is just their body protecting them, right? So now let's get into a little bit more about that gene mutation I talked about earlier, that MTHFR, because like I said, this is a really common one. A lot of our kids tend to have this or have traits of it. So there is a tie that I am noticing personally as somebody like, right, we pretty much only see kids who are very selective eaters. That's really all we specialize in. So I do notice this as sort of a trend or a pattern that has emerged over time for me in my practice. But let's talk about ties, oral ties, and how they connect back to genetics and to this MTHFR gene mutation. Because, like I said before, there's midline differences. So it just means it structures down the middle of the body, like where your tongue, your lips are, even your palate can develop a little differently. So tongue and lip ties are like the most common ones. And, those midline structures develop very early in pregnancy, and it's related to that folate. Is it actually working and doing what it's supposed to do? Because what it's supposed to do is those ties, they're not supposed to be so far forward. They're supposed to be back a little bit more. And that's really where the issue comes in with the ties, is that they're not really fully receded as they should be. And here's where it gets personal for me. So when I first started learning about feeding, I actually suspected, I probably have this gene mutation myself. My son struggled with feeding as a baby. He had ties. That's kind of how I got into all of this in the first place, right? But the way he struggled, I've struggled. Even from what my mom has told me when I was a baby, sounded very similar to my son. And it just sort of all made sense. And when I got pregnant with my second child, I actually asked them to run that as part of the blood work testing, because I wanted a definite yes or no. And sure enough, I was right. I do have this gene mutation. So this isn't just a theory for me. I have lived it as a parent and a professional. But again, why does this matter for picky eating? Because the ties are not just a tiny piece of skin or connective tissue, right? It can make feeding painful. It can make it inefficient from day one, right? Imagine being a newborn trying to nurse, but your tongue can't extend properly. You can't get a good latch. It's clumsy. Babies adapt however they can, but sometimes that leads to swallowing a lot of air, getting reflux, falling asleep exhausted before they've had enough to eat. And here's the part that a lot of parents don't realize. Later on when they become picky, looking back, a lot of times when they were an infant, there was some sort of struggle there. But the brain at that young, very, very young infant age learns at a subconscious level that food is struggle, food is hard. And later on, it could lead to rejection of other foods. We've talked about that in other episodes, so I won't get into it too much. But, a lot of parents will say in our evaluation, oh, I just thought my baby didn't like nursing. That's what the doctor told me. Or I just thought I always had a problem with my milk supply. But when we zoom out, it really does kind of all add up and make a lot of sense. And this is why I do what I do, because parents are told it's just a phase. They just didn't like it. They just give them a bottle, or, they have MTHFR, just give them more folic acid. No one ever gets the full picture. That's why in my practice, we don't just look at how many foods a kid is eating. We really have to look at the whole child. We look at their oral motor skills, their gut health, sensory sensitivities, and when relevant, genes, right? Because you can't solve picky eating looking at just one piece. You have to look at the whole child. Okay. So I want to talk now about some signs that you can look for easily, even today, in infants and in kids, because I'm sure you're wondering, like, how do I know if this is part of why my kid is struggling, right? So let's talk about some of the most common things that we could easily see, right? In infants, tongue or lip tie right from birth, right? These are those midline differences. In rare cases, things like cleft palate, right? But that's on the rarer side. Usually it's things like tongue or lip tie. Things like challenging bottle feedings or breastfeedings. In infants, right? Reflux or constant spit up. right? Sometimes it's not just an immature digestive system. They're swallowing a lot of air because they don't have a good latch. Difficulty gaining weight, right? They might be falling asleep constantly during feeds because it's exhausting to try to get that milk from the bottle. They might be colicky or extremely fussy and have a hard time settling with your usual tricks. Okay, so those are some things in infants that might tip you off that there is something more going on. Okay, then toddlers, young kids, and I would say even into adults, extreme pickiness, right? Going beyond normal toddler phases. So refusing entire categories of food, strong texture or taste sensitivities, right? We talked about that a little bit with the vegetables, with that tasting gene. Some gut red flags like chronic constipation, diarrhea, stomach aches could be some of those genes related to the gut, right? Low energy, frequent illness. If they're not absorbing B12 or folate well, they might be tired, get sick more often, on the paler side, right? Now, there are some other cues here as well. You might, especially for MTHFR, there's some facial features that are different, right? There is dark circles that could form under the eye or like a bluish tint under the eyes. There's also a bluish vein that can be more prominent on the bridge of the nose. I know me and my son both have that as well. Something called a methylation crease or a vertical groove between the philtrum and the upper lip right here. Okay, could be also things like skin issues, right? So that DAO gene might have eczema, frequent rashes because it's linked to detox pathways and histamine intolerance. Okay, let's see what else. Hair and nails can be brittle, right? If you have that B12 or folate deficiency because of the MTHFR, you might have more brittle nails, slow growing hair. Okay. Even things that are behavioral, like high anxiety, low energy, mood swings can overlap with nutrition and that methylation difficulty that MTHFR has. Okay. So these are things you can easily look for or check off as, oh yeah, that sounds like my child, right? And here's why working with a specialist really matters. You don't have to guess whether it's sensory, genetic, gut, oral motor. When we do our mealtime roadmap, our Unlocking Mealtimes roadmap, we try to break this down for you if we're suspecting that there is a further issue, telling you the next step. It's just not something you're going to get in your run-of-the-mill insurance-based feeding evaluation. We just go so deep looking at the entire child. And that brings me to, what the heck are you going to do about this, right? So let's say you're hearing this and you're thinking to yourself, well, a lot of this sounds an awful lot like my child, but what am I supposed to do about it? Okay, so I want to tell you, testing should be fairly straightforward. You don't necessarily have to go to a geneticist. Okay, when I did my MTHFR blood test, it was part of my prenatal panel. I think you can even do a cheek swab. Some doctors can order it through a lab panel, but I think there's actually some direct to customer kits you can even order online. So the test itself is very easy. And here's my advice. If you don't want to guess, then just get tested. If your pediatrician won't order it, find somebody who will. It's literally just putting in a lab order. So you have nothing to lose by learning the information, only knowledge to gain. So I don't see why anyone would deny it. But we'll talk about pediatrician objections in a moment. Right, you don't have to do this test, though, to help your child. I was suspecting I had it. I had a lot of the signs of it. And that was enough for me to be like, okay, I think I just need to, amp up what I'm eating and the types of vitamins I'm taking. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit as well. So stay tuned. If you want some of those like next steps, like what to do. So you can just be more intentional instead of, just ignoring everything. But it can help you feel more validated, like, oh, okay, this was not in my head. There is actually something else going on here. Here's the reality of asking your pediatrician, right? Not all pediatricians think genetic testing is necessary. And, but they might be right on that sometimes. It's not standard care. But here's the problem. If they brush you off and they just say, take more folic acid, that advice actually is backwards for someone with MTHFR. In fact, your body can't even use folic acid. It builds up in your system and causes more harm, right? And this happened to me. So when my OB read the labs and they told me, oh, don't worry about it. Just take some more folic acid. It's no big deal if you have this. A lot of people have this. And I said, well, folic acid is actually going to make things worse. What I need is methylfolate, the natural form. That's the one that my body can readily use. And we've had clients hear this same thing from other doctors. Doctor said, give them more folic acid, but that's not the correct form your body needs. Folic acid is actually a synthetic form of folate. So what your body has to do is convert folic acid to folate to then use it. So there's that extra step is what your body actually can't really do very well. So you might be thinking that you're helping by giving folic acid when in fact it's going in and getting stuck. It's not getting through to where it's supposed to. And then it just builds up in your system over time and could cause other issues. So doctors can be well-meaning, but they don't get nutrition training and they're not studying every gene mutation. So you need to be educated and advocate for your child. And it's why specialists exist, right? To help you sort through it, to help you make sense of it. So some practical next steps that I would recommend is taking the right vitamins. You might have heard me say that you need methylfolate. So methyl B12, not folic acid. So taking the right vitamins, making sure that you have the correct form of folate, going to be my top suggestion there if you have that MTHFR gene mutation. You also want to eat for your gene type, right? So, for example, natural folate is in leafy greens, beans, lentils, avocados. It's in meat. B12 is, meat, eggs, dairy. Even though they're probably the foods your child is avoiding, that's why it's going to be really important to try to get in the supplement while we're working towards the actually adding more foods to their diet, right? So that's why we have that as part of our program with those specific suggestions and why we can try to tailor trying to get those foods in as more of like a priority if we can. I would say get regular labs done. Don't just check the gene. Maybe monitor your nutrients. Ask for labs for iron, folate, B12, homocysteine. They'll give you a snapshot of whether your child's body is actually getting what it needs. Because at the end of the day, testing is helpful, but supporting your child's body with the right nutrients, food, lab checks, that will make a huge difference. Okay. And this is exactly why I call myself a holistic feeding therapist, because it's so much more than how many foods they're eating or whether they'll take a bite of broccoli at dinner, right? When we look at feeding challenges, we're not just looking at their behavior. We have to look at the whole child, their genetics, their gut, their oral motor, their sensory sensitivities, their mindset. What are they thinking about food? So when a parent comes to me and says, my child only eats 5 foods, I don't just hand them a sticker chart and say, let's bribe them to eat food number 6. Okay, instead, we have to ask, is there an oral tie that made eating hard and struggle from the start? Is there a genetic piece like MTHFR that's affecting how they process nutrients? Is their nervous system on overdrive from sensory sensitivities? Is their gut health making eating uncomfortable for them? Because picky eating is usually not just one thing, it's a puzzle. And when you zoom out and look at the whole picture, you'll finally start seeing why your child is eating the way that they are. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. So there's a few genes that can make picky eating harder. We have that MTHFR, the taster gene, TAS2R38, right? The bitter taste gene, the FUT2 gene, right? Which affects B12 absorption in the microbiome, the DAO gene, which affects histamine breakdown, and that HLA-DQ2, the celiac gene, right? I know we spent a lot of time on that MTHFR with the folate and B12 absorption and the oral motor issues that go with that. But those are genes that could make that picky eating a little bit more exacerbated, okay? Having one or more of these genes can definitely tip the scales and make eating harder. But again, there isn't one picky eating gene. Okay, now if MTHFR is in the picture, here's 3 things that you can do, right? We're going to use the right vitamins. We're looking for methylfolate and methyl B12, not folic acid. Okay, number 2, we're eating food that actually fuels the body. So I mentioned them before, the leafy greens, beans, lentils, avocados, meats, and eggs. Now, number 3, getting lab checked regularly, checking those B12 folate levels, homocysteine, and iron will give you a clear snapshot of what your child's body is actually using. Okay. If you don't want to guess, then don't. Just get the right vitamins, eat the right foods, check the right labs. You don't have to guess this. So, if you're listening and thinking, this is my child, this makes so much sense, I have to look into this more. Here's the next step. All right, if you haven't already, you can take our free quiz at thepickyEatersTest.com. You'll see if your child is in the fearful, stuck, or curious stage of eating. And I'll send you more tailored next steps and resources to start making progress right away. Now, if you're ready for personalized help, my Unlocking Mealtimes roadmap goes way beyond any other beating a value you've ever had, way beyond behavior charts. We look at everything, all of the pieces of the puzzle. You can finally stop guessing and start moving forward with a step-by-step plan, because picky eating, again, is never just about the food. It's about the whole child and how it's all coming together for them. Right? So hopefully you learned today, is picky eating genetic? Maybe, but here's what's for certain. With the right support, they do not have to stay stuck as a picky eater. Like we said, those genes can definitely tip the scales into the eating is harder realm, but it's not just going to be, well, now that we know this gene, we've solved the problem. Or now that we've gotten that tie release, we've solved the problem. It's a combination of things, right? And we are always trying to figure out what is the most pressing thing to work on, right? So that's what we do in our program. When we do our roadmap, we map everything out about their personality, their sensory profile, what's going on with their oral motor skills and their muscles and all the muscles in their mouth, and how is everything working together, and which thing are we going to prioritize first, second, third, what needs to be worked on to see progress, and perhaps what are some next steps. Maybe it is, hey, you need to get a lab test or a gut test, or, it might be seen in ENT, or, we'll give you the next steps of what we think needs to happen for you to see progress. So if it's of interest to you, if you wanted to go that one step further, if you wanted to be super thorough and comprehensive and leave no stone unturned, that's what our program is designed to do. So head on over to foodologyfeedingtherapy.com and you can learn all about our Unlocking Mealtimes program under courses. You can learn all about our programs, listen to more podcast episodes, get more insights, and listen to or look at all of our resources that we have. We have hundreds of resources for you on all different topics related to picky eating. So I hope this was helpful, and we hope to see you again next week. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you for listening to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater. To learn more about achieving your child's feeding goals, check out Christine's website at foodologyfeeding.com. And be sure to tune in next time to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater.